Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qizhi. Coming up in this edition, former South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has returned to jail with an approved warrant, accused of obstruction of justice and abuse of power. The European Union remains hopeful of reaching a trade deal with the United States before August 1st and avoiding a sharp rise in tariffs. And Yemen's Houthis have attacked a ship they say was banned from entering occupied Palestinian ports and shows support for Gaza. We begin in Asia. Former South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has returned to jail after a court approved a warrant sought by prosecutors. According to the Special Counsel investigation, the former president's attempt to impose martial law in December represented obstruction of justice and abuse of power. Xinhan reports from Wuhan.
Former President Yoon Suk-yeol has now been formally arrested and is being held here at the Seoul Detention Center. A judge here approving an arrest warrant in the early hours of Thursday, agreeing with the special prosecutor investigating the case that Mr. Yoon could interfere with witnesses or tamper with evidence. The now former president is under investigation for allegedly plotting to declare martial law last December, a move that led to his impeachment in April. The special prosecutor in his request accusing Mr. Yoon of abuse of power and obstruction of justice, among other charges. Here outside the detention center, security remains extremely tight. There's a large law enforcement presence here and a small contingent of his supporters that continue to stand by the former president.
I came out here today to tell President Yoon Suk-yeol to stay strong and have courage, even as he heads to court for questioning. He should know that behind him are patriotic citizens like us, working hard for our country and supporting him all the way.
Now, Mr. Yoon's legal team, meanwhile, calling the warrant unreasonable and denying all allegations against him. Remember, the former president is already undergoing a separate criminal trial on charges of insurrection over his failed martial law bid. This is the second time he's been detained here. Earlier this year, he spent nearly 2 months in detention before being released on technical grounds while he was actually still the president. Now, as a former president, Mr. Yoon will be held here pending further investigation for up to 20 days as prosecutors prepare a formal indictment. Truly unprecedented, as this marks the first time a former South Korean leader has been impeached, removed, and then jailed in a special prosecutor-led investigation.
That was Xinhan reporting in South Korea. Elsewhere in Asia, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his counterparts from ASEAN countries have held a meeting in Kuala Lumpur. The meeting coincides with the 58th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting this week, with economic ties and strategic partnerships dominating the discussions. From the Malaysian capital, here's Ryan Meltzer.
Morning did begin with the ASEAN plus China meeting, with ASEAN and China being each other's number one trading partners, having already concluded the upgrade to their free trade agreement, the AFTA 3.0 as it's called, and as well as having comprehensive strategic partnership. So the ties are already very strong, and of course with all the external strains and stresses of the US policy primarily and the threats to the trading order, it's likely to push China and ASEAN to seek even greater areas of cooperation, intra-regional trade, intra-regional investment. And the ASEAN plus 3 meeting, which is ASEAN plus China, Japan and South Korea. And let's face it, the 3 East Asian countries often don't see eye to eye, but I think that Trump's trade policies are focusing minds here. These countries, China, Japan, South Korea and the ASEAN countries, are all part of the giant free trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And they need to look at how to build upon that even further to boost intra-regional trade and investment. And I think that Trump's policies are really adding impetus to already the strong momentum that RCEP had given. We heard Wang Yi at the opening remarks for the ASEAN plus China meeting saying it's a choice between peace and conflict, cooperation and confrontation. And when it comes to ASEAN plus China, clearly the hope is for great deal of cooperation and to look at ways to reduce the tensions that do exist, particularly in the South China Sea. And as well, I think now that we're going to see that with the ASEAN plus 3 too, that the East Asian countries plus ASEAN are going to look to put their differences behind them and focus on how they can collaborate to combat these tariffs. Because out of these countries, the 10 plus 3, only Singapore faces the minimum 10% tariff as it stands right now, and the rest face tariffs of between 25 and 40%. So the potential devastating impact on the economies of this region, on the supply chains and so on is very clear. So it's time for them to band together even more and build on the already very deep ties and collaboration and cooperation. And this platform is a good place to make the next step toward doing that.
That was Ryan Mauser in Kuala Lumpur. In Europe, the European Union remains hopeful of reaching a trade deal with the United States before August 1st and avoiding a sharp rise in tariffs. William Denslow has more from Brussels.
The European Commission says its teams have been working tirelessly on both a political and technical level to reach an agreement in principle with the US. President Donald Trump threatened back in April to raise tariffs on European goods to 50%, up from a benchmark 10% level if no deal was reached in 90 days. That's on top of a 50% duty on steel and aluminium, as well as a 25% tariff on car imports. The deadline has been pushed back to August, but the White House has suggested that the EU could receive a letter informing it of a new tariff rate later this week. Over a dozen nations have received such letters, but European Commission officials say they expect to avoid this fate and resolve trade disputes through dialogue, potentially in the coming days.
We count on the US continuing to engage in this sense. Reaching a deal now depends on the willingness to find an outcome that is acceptable to both sides.
President Trump this week said the EU is being very nice, having alleged that it had treated the US badly in the past. The EU has criticised the use of tariffs, describing them as a tool that hurts businesses and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. Addressing the European Parliament, the Commissioner for Trade said he wanted transatlantic trade ties to return to a more predictable path.
The agreement in principle we are striving to finalise is not the end, but rather the start of the new beginning. It would provide a framework upon which we can continue to build, defining the exact parameters of the later agreement.
The European Commission has been tight-lipped on the details of the negotiations and whether certain tariffs will remain in place. The EU says it seeks a win-win outcome, but has a raft of countermeasures lined up should the two sides fail to come to an agreement.
That was William Denslow in Brussels. The leaders of France and Britain have agreed that they need new solutions to counter illegal migration. French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer laid the groundwork for a bilateral summit in London on Thursday. Macron's trip to London is the first state visit by a European leader to the UK since Britain left the European Union in 2020. Rahul Pathak reports from London.
Talks between the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and the French President Emmanuel Macron have come to an end at 10 Downing Street. There was a very long statement issued by Downing Street in the last hour. I'm just going to read you, I promise, just a short bit. It said the leaders agreed tackling the threat of irregular migration and small boat crossings was a shared priority that required shared solutions, and the two leaders agreed on the need to go further and make progress on new and innovative solutions, including a new deterrence, as you say, to break the business model of the gangs organising these illegal crossings. Now, there is no more details on what this new deterrent is going to be. Interestingly, no talk really of the one-in, one-out migration plan proposed by the UK, as clearly no agreement has been made on that. Just to explain what that proposed deal involves, that arrangement would allow Britain to return migrants who arrive by small boats back to France in exchange for asylum seekers who have a link to the UK, like a family link to Britain. Now, Keir Starmer really needs this deal to go through because it would allow him to keep his election pledge to stop the tens of thousands of people coming into Britain from the English Channel. Now, this year has already seen 20,000 people arrive illegally here via the English Channel crossing, and that is a record for this point in the year. More talks are planned on this, and it appears certainly on the surface, the pictures that we've seen so far, that Starmer and Macron seem to have quite a good, healthy personal relationship, and that comes after years of bad blood between the two nations, especially following the Brexit vote. So maybe that can translate into more closer cooperation between the UK and France when it comes to illegal migration.
That was Rahul Pathak in London. Turning to the Middle East, Yemen's Houthis have attacked the ship that they claim violated the ban on entry to occupied Palestinian ports. The vessel is one of the 200 US, British and Israeli ships targeted by the group since November 2023 as part of the group's efforts to voice support for Gaza. Ihab Al-Fandi has more from Sana.
After several weeks of relative calm, the Red Sea has seen new escalation this week. The Ansar Allah group officially claimed an attack on the ship Magic Seas. At the same time, international reports said another ship called Eternity Sea was hit in a separate attack in the same area. 4 crew members were killed. No group has officially claimed responsibility for the second attack so far.
There is no doubt that the Yemeni armed forces have stepped up their military operations in the Red Sea in response to the Israeli escalation, brutality, and crimes against our people and brothers in Gaza. This escalation is also a form of strong military pressure on the Israeli entity, aimed at tightening the economic blockade on it and forcing it to stop its attacks.
Ansar Allah released video footage showing the cargo ship Magic Seas sinking after it was hit by naval missiles in the Red Sea. The footage showed smoke rising from the ship before it tilted and sank completely. This is one of the most notable attacks carried out by the group as part of its naval operations linked to the war in Gaza.
The naval operations come as part of Yemen's declared response to block Israel for committing massacres against civilians in the Gaza Strip. It's also in retaliation for the Israeli aggression against Yemeni ports.
Ansar Allah says its operations in the Red Sea and its direct attacks on Israel will continue until the war in Gaza ends and the blockade is lifted. The group says ships linked to Israel will remain military targets as long as the escalation continues. The Red Sea remains a hot spot for Ansar Allah's operations. Any potential comment in the area is directly to ending the war in Gaza. This makes the naval conflict part of the wider regional conflict and serves as massive pressure on Israel's backers.
That was Ihab Al-Fandi reporting. Finally, in North America, rescuers in flood-hit Texas are battling tough conditions to search for the missing. The devastating floods have killed at least 119 people, with many victims children. Over 170 are still missing. Edith Tianzhan has more from Kerrville.
Search and rescue operations have expanded by the day, and so has the number of casualties from this historic incident. This has now gone down in history as one of the most devastating and deadliest disasters in the history of Texas. It's just a tiny snapshot of what prevails this entire neighborhood. Into the next neighboring county as well. You've got hundreds of trees that are either bent sideways or some of them have just been snapped in half. I mean, it's an awe-inspiring spectacle. To give you an idea of how forceful these flash floods were, I was talking to some of the witnesses earlier. They said it only took some minutes for the water to rise several meters and take anything in their way. Now, in the meantime, the state officials are also coming under some criticism regarding an early warning system that didn't exist for the most part in much of this area, even though traditionally in the past several decades, similar flash floods tend to take place in this area.
Every football team makes mistakes. The losing teams are the ones that try to point out who's to blame. The championship teams are the ones that say, don't worry about it, man, we got this. We're going to make sure that we go score again, that we're going to win this game. The way winners talk is not to point fingers. They talk about solutions.
This was Governor Abbott's way of deflecting some of that criticism. Perhaps he was saying that we're going to learn from our mistakes for the future, but many people thought this was an insensitive way to compare essentially what's happened here to a football game. But for now, the search and rescue operations are still going on. As the governor himself said, we expect this to continue in a full-scale operation as long as it's needed, until that every single unaccounted person is finally accounted for. This is a weather phenomenon that is currently happening in multiple locations and just across the border, actually, in the state of New Mexico. We've just had other flash floods happening in a historic mountaintop neighborhood called Ruidoso, where at least 3 people have been killed, 2 of them, unfortunately, children.
That was Edith Tianzhan reporting from Texas. Now, recapping the headlines before we go, former South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has returned to jail with an approved warrant, accused of obstruction of justice and abuse of power. The European Union remains hopeful of reaching a trade deal with Washington before August the 1st and avoiding a sharp rise in tariffs. And Yemen's Houthis have attacked a ship they say was banned from entering occupied Palestinian ports to show support for Gaza. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.